The New Orleans Saints swap players in a win-win trade with one of the last teams you might expect. We got all that and a little bit of lagniappe for you on today's episode of Locked On Saints.
You are Locked On Saints, your daily New Orleans Saints podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is good, Who Dat Nation and Who Dat family? I am your host, your friend Ross Jackson, New Orleans native, your New Orleans Saints expert and credentialed member of the media covering those New Orleans Saints as a Saints beat writer over at LouisianaSports.net. And on today's episode of Locked On Saints, Isaiah Foskey remains amongst the New Orleans Saints that feel like they might be in the most trouble. We'll go through a couple of them. The New Orleans Saints quarterback battle seems likely to go into next week's game against the Denver Broncos. We're going to kick everything off with the New Orleans Saints trading with the Jacksonville Jaguars of all teams, the team that they just played against on Sunday, in a player-for-player swap that's actually a pretty good example of a win-win trade. We got all that coming up for you on today's episode. We appreciate you very much, whether it's your first time or your next time being here with us this time, making us your first listen, and being an everydayer here on the show, which is a proud part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. The New Orleans Saints trade Khalen Saunders, former New Orleans Saints defensive tackle, to the Jacksonville Jaguars, who they had literally just finished playing hours before the trade was done. In return, they get backup center in Luke Fortner. So I wanted to break down why I think this is a little bit of a win-win for everybody involved. Let's start with the two teams, the Saints and the Jaguars. The Jaguars needed some help when it came to their run defense and really their defensive line, all that, looking for more players to kind of rotate in there. So the Saints send over Khalen Saunders, who didn't necessarily have the best fit in New Orleans since the installation of Brandon Staley's defense. Our final part of the show today is going to be about players that found themselves in trouble after the second preseason game. And I was going to put Khalen Saunders on that list. It was interesting that Devon Godshaw and Brian Brzee and Nathan Shepard all got the day off up against Jacksonville, but Khalen Saunders played deep into the first quarter throughout that game. And so that was a little bit surprising to me, and I thought was indicative about maybe what the question marks were around his spot. So now the win for New Orleans is that they don't have to cut him at the end of it all. Instead, they send him somewhere where he can find a role, a win for Khalen Saunders, who wasn't necessarily finding a role here in New Orleans. The Jaguars get their win because they get Khalen Saunders, and the Saints get a little bit of a win here by getting another interior offensive lineman that's got over 2,500 snaps of career experience. That was a part of that Kentucky Big Blue Wall, along with Landon Young, who's currently on the roster. And so they do that by landing Luke Fortner in the trade in a rare player-for-player swap. But this works for New Orleans. They lost Will Clapp for the entire season due to an injury. They lost Nick Saldiveri before preseason even began, just a little ways into training camp for the season. Trevor Penning, starting left guard, is currently dealing with a toe injury that might keep him out for some amount of weeks. We'll see. And so New Orleans, who struck gold as they found with Torricelli Simpkins, who we'll discuss here in a little bit, they end up bringing in another interior offensive lineman that played over 800 snaps at one guard spot during his collegiate days, over 600 snaps at the other guard spot during his collegiate days, and has played over 2,500 snaps in his NFL career since being a number 65 overall selection in the 2022 NFL draft by the Jacksonville Jaguars at center. And so now New Orleans, who has struggled to find center depth in the past couple of years, now has another option, right? They brought in Will Clapp, hoping that he might be able to help there. Nick Saldiveri had a little bit of center swing experience during his time at the Senior Bowl. Not necessarily sure that that's anything that the Saints would have been willing to rely upon or try out, but he certainly had that. And then, of course, Torricelli Simpkins, who's been awesome here over the course of the preseason. They also had Kyle Hergel in the back, and then Mike Panasiuk, who they just signed not too long ago, who also has some center experience. But now in this trade, they land Luke Fortner, who's got a lot of snaps in the NFL at center, right at the NFL against NFL competition, which I do think is an important piece. So over 2,500 career snaps, like we mentioned, but only 6 sacks given up. And, hasn't always rated highly when it came to like your standard Pro Football Focus grades and stuff like that. But the raw numbers show that he's been productive and he's going to be a good depth player if he even makes the roster for you. Look, I don't think that Khalen Saunders was on his way to making this 53-man roster. And I think the fact that he played so deep into the first quarter in that game against the Jacksonville Jaguars was pretty indicative of that. And I think a big part of it doesn't have anything to do with his talent level. He's a ridiculously talented player, right? Great size, great athleticism, wonderful locker room presence as well, great community presence, and is also, a two-time Super Bowl champion who can bring some Super Bowl pedigree experience to your roster. And for those reasons, I was thinking about keeping him. But even when we did the 53-man projection before the preseason started, I mentioned to where it was basically going to be down to him or Nathan Shepard. And like on the right day, I would take Nathan Shepard over Khalen Saunders on that 53-man roster. My next 53-man roster was going to be without Khalen Saunders. And I was, expecting to have to kind of defend that and all these other things. And now the Saints have traded him away. So that's how they figured out. Look, this defensive tackle room, which features those three guys that I mentioned earlier, Devon Gottschall, Brian Brzee, Nathan Shepard. But then you have all these other really talented players. A third-round pick that you just invested in Vernon Broughton. You bring in a John Ridgeway last year via trade. Christian Boyd has really stepped up over the course of these last couple of preseason games and throughout training camp as well. And you end up with all these other guys that are still there too that can stand up for you and be sort of 3-4 defensive ends, like a Jonah Williams, for instance, and that can do a little more. And I know I didn't name everybody, but you get the idea here. The Saints had a lot of work to do if they wanted to cut down this defensive tackle room. And don't forget too, they just recently added Jaden Peavy to kind of add to that as a 6 foot, 300 plus pound guy. He's big. He's a big 6'5", actually, big dude. And so now you have all of these options. And you were going to have to cut bait with somebody. So at least in this way, you get something for someone. Now, there was some, conversation around how Luke Fortner might have been on the chopping block anyway in Jacksonville. But at least this way, the Saints make sure that they get him as opposed to having to deal with waivers and things like that. Similarly, for Jacksonville, Khalen Saunders might have ended up on the chopping block by the end of the preseason. Now they make sure that they get him. So that's what I mean. It's a win for the Saints because they get more offensive line depth, which they desperately need. The Jaguars get a win because they get Khalen Saunders. Khalen Saunders gets a win because he lands at a place where he'll be able to have a fit. And Luke Fortner gets a win because he lands in a place that desperately needs him. And so I think that now what this might mean is that either, and you can make this decision if you're the Saints, you keep Fortner at center and then let Torricelli Simpkins play more guard, which I think could be really, really good for this team. Or you keep Torricelli Simpkins at center, where he has balled out over the course of the preseason, and then give Fortner an opportunity at guard. So I don't think that it keeps Simpkins off of the roster because I don't think that the Saints can go into the regular season with only 8 offensive linemen anyway. I think they're going to need 9, and they're going to need more on their practice squad too. So I don't think that this pushes Simpkins out of the 53-man roster. I think that basically Simpkins, Fortner, Radence, and then probably Landon Young end up being those 4 depth pieces behind their starting 5. And so Simpkins should be just fine here. It's just going to be really interesting now to where they see, do they give him an opportunity to push at one of those guard spots when it comes to depth? So good moves all around for New Orleans, an interesting way to handle things as they move forward. And coming up next, they might need to come up with an interesting way to handle this quarterback competition as well. We got that coming up for you as we continue on with today's episode of Locked On Saints, part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. This episode is brought to you by BetterHelp. These days, it feels like there's advice for, everything. Cold plunges, gratitude journals, screen detoxes. But the big question is, how do you actually know what it is that you need? That's why it's time now for you to take a moment to talk to a licensed therapist through BetterHelp, and it'll make all of the difference. You can get real personalized guidance instead of guessing what's going to work based on some social media posts. I've been using BetterHelp since the pandemic. It's been very helpful, not just for the big things in life, but even for the small things in life, in terms of understanding when it is time to have that screen detox, when it is time to take control of your negative self-narratives and things like that. Like, I've got a lot of mental health stuff in terms of anxiety and everything. BetterHelp's helped a ton with that as well. So look, talk it out today with BetterHelp. Our listeners will get 10% off of their first month at BetterHelp.com/locked on. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/locked on. All right. right, family, I think this New Orleans Saints quarterback battle is going to go into a third preseason game. And I want to highlight some of the pros and cons of going that route. And in fact, I'd like to start with the cons. I think that this quarterback battle is probably going to go into a third preseason game. And I have a couple of theories as to why. The first of which is that, like, Tyler Shough has had a really good push here recently during training camp, and then the team's two quarterback options, Tyler Shough and Spencer Rattler, effectively split the first two preseason games. It felt like Tyler Shough had sort of the more, I'm going to call it standout-ish, right? More standout-ish because he had the 54-yard deep pass. He bounced back from the pick six, all this other stuff. He led a couple of scoring drives. So more of sort of the standout-ish performance against the Chargers. As for Spencer Rattler, I felt that he had the clearly more standout-ish performance up against the Jacksonville Jaguars. Now, the tricky part of all that is that these are both guys that stood out during the second half of a preseason game. And so everyone's going to discount a lot of what each of them did, especially depending upon which side is more, I don't know, the loyalism around quarterbacks is still so strange to me, but there is a lot of loyalism around these two quarterbacks. And so some folks will say that, you know, the fact that one of them did better in the second half means less than the fact that the other one did better in the second half, whatever it might be. But for me, just looking at these two players individually, regardless entirely of the competition that they were going up against, how do they take advantage of the opportunities that were in front of them? Well, it felt like both of them that got in during a second half very much took advantage of the opportunities that were in front of them. And that's good news. Tyler Shough played against every starter on that Jacksonville Jaguars defensive line, with the exception of Tyson Campbell and, of course, Travis Hunter, who kind of plays both ways in that way. And so I think that, you know, you can look at Tyler Shough and you can say, okay, well, how did he perform against a first-team defense? And then you can look at Spencer Rattler, who's performed against first-team defenses already within his career, and then make that decision based on that. But really, what you're trying to figure out is, where are these two quarterbacks now? And one of the big cons of waiting until after the third preseason game is that you spend all of your time figuring out where these two quarterbacks are now, and then you lose a little bit of that opportunity to start building around one of these quarterbacks. I think that's the biggest thing that anyone's going to point out as a potential con around the idea of waiting. Con, I mean non-pro, right? As a negative. As opposed to, is the fact that if they wait until after that third preseason game, that because of that, it's going to, you know, take longer for that quarterback to catch a rhythm with their offense, because they're going to be, you know, only getting 2 weeks of run going into that first season game, that first regular season game as the starter or what have you. But on the pros side, I think you want to give these guys every opportunity possible. And I think the Saints specifically want Tyler Shough to have every opportunity possible. The Saints don't want the easy decision. They don't want the analyst pick. They want their pick. They don't want the fan pick. They want their pick. And in order for them to be able to do that accurately, and to do that as accurately as they can, at least, they need to be as informed as possible. And so going into a third preseason game gives you, as another pro, the opportunity, or as a pro, the opportunity to be able to gather as much information as possible. Now, the other con behind all this is that you're still kind of moving these quarterbacks about, and nobody's really building, like, beyond just the idea of them getting chemistry with the players. How are you building the offense around them, right? Like, Kellen Moore kind of spoke about this not too long ago, that there's not really any tailoring of the offense for either quarterback right now. I think that they've each had conversations about how they would tailor if they win, like, do a little bit more of this. What do you like those types of conversations. You're going to have that with any quarterback that's a part of a quarterback battle, and that's expected to potentially be your future quarterback for the foreseeable, coming, future. And so I think that really, though, that doesn't get installed and implemented until one of those quarterbacks is selected. Now, what works out in the Saints' favor when it comes to that is that this isn't your typical preseason. So you would have 4 preseason games, and right after the 4th preseason game, you're into roster cuts, and the very next weekend, you're playing a regular season game. Now, you play your 3rd preseason game, you have a week, and then you get into game prep for week 1. So you kind of have this week 0 now, which gives you an opportunity to be able to do those things that we're talking about with building the offense around that starting quarterback. I think, too, that the idea that you have to have one of these quarterbacks selected early and then build around that quarterback as quickly as you can is true for a team that is a contender. the New Orleans Saints are not viewed as contenders right now. They're viewed as a rebuilding team. And so do you really need, as a rebuilding team that also has eschewed the idea of bringing in a veteran quarterback, that has not and it is very unlikely to be interested in pursuing a quarterback elsewhere, and are very, very happy to kind of ride things out with their young quarterbacks and let things play out? This tells you that this is not a team that's necessarily in what we're used to seeing, which is a win now mode. And if you're not in a win now mode, then what really is if you're not in a win now mode, what really is the massive detraction from saying, yeah, 2 weeks, and then use those 2 weeks to build around whichever guy that quarterback is. And then they'll go into the first week, learn, go into the second week, learn, go into the third week, learn, go into the fourth week, learn, so on and so forth. Because I don't think that either one of these quarterbacks comes out playing like gangbusters right out the case. Now, that could be the case, very, very much so, especially when that offense is being tailored to them. And when we're seeing the full implementation of Kellen Moore's offense and run game and how that supports the young quarterback and what Brandon Staley's defense actually looks like, because we haven't really gotten an opportunity to see that either during these preseason games, because so many starters are already solidified that so many starters haven't really been playing over on that defensive side of the football. And so how does all of that help out the young quarterback? Well, that might put the quarterback in advantageous situations, and then they do come out playing like gangbusters right out the box. But until we see that, there's no reason to assume that's going to be the case, nor is there any reason to assume it's not going to be the case. And so really, I think you just focus on getting as much information as you can and then tailor the offense over the time that you have, knowing that you'll continue to tinker and toy with the offense throughout the rest of the season for as long as that quarterback is in place. And then maybe you make a switch at a later point so that you get a look at both of these quarterbacks before you go into the 2026 draft and potentially make a decision to bring in a new quarterback to enter the discussion for the 2026 season. All of that is very possible. But do I think that it's a bad thing that the Saints might take this into a third game? No. And again, I do think that with Spencer Rattler having had 7 game appearances and 6 game starts last year, that the Saints want to give Tyler Shuck every opportunity. And I think that a part of that is going to be going through this prep week again and getting into that final preseason game. Coming up next, there were a couple of New Orleans Saints that didn't do themselves any favors on Sunday in the tie with Jacksonville Jaguars. And again, on top of the list is still Isaiah Foskey. We got that coming up for you next. We continue on with today's episode of Locked On Saints, part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. This episode is presented by Yahoo Fantasy. Me and some of the other executive team members here at Locked On are going to be playing our fantasy football leagues over at Yahoo Fantasy. And you should be too, whether you're a first-timer or you're a veteran that's making your millionth league. And especially if you're a veteran, you already know that the Yahoo Fantasy Football app has everything that you need, and it only is getting better. To celebrate 28 years of fantasy football greatness, Yahoo Fantasy is dropping 28 big new features over 28 days throughout August. To kick it off, they just dropped the Yahoo Fantasy Guillotine Leagues, a killer new way to play fantasy football on Yahoo, where the lowest scoring team is eliminated each week until one team is left standing. With the season right around the corner, now is a great time to get your league together and try out this new mode. If you're more into the classics, you can still play head-to-head in a private league or join a public league as well. So stay tuned for more killer announcements and start playing Yahoo Fantasy Football now at yahoofantasy.com/LockedOnNFL. That's yahoofantasy.com/LockedOnNFL. Let's get it, Who Dat Nation. I got 5 players that I don't know necessarily did themselves a lot of favors during that Sunday preseason game against the Jacksonville Jaguars, one of which is a guy that we talked about last week as well, and I want to start here again, and that's pass rusher, edge rusher, defensive end, Isaiah Foskey. Now, unlike last week, where he contributed an assisted tackle, which I do believe was actually also a tackle for a loss, by the way. But unlike last week, he did notch more stats and contributions during this game. He didn't play as much as he did last week, where he played the majority of snaps, but he did still appear, according to Pro Football Focus, for 39 snaps during this game, and ended up with a stat line that was pretty simple. 2 tackles, that included 1 assisted tackle, and he had 3 combined tackles as a whole. Now, I will give Isaiah Foskey some props that are deserved when the Saints had that interception towards the end of the game, the offense for the Jacksonville Jaguars worked themselves into a 3rd and 14. On that 3rd and 14 play, the quarterback dumps it off to a receiver, and that receiver or that pass catcher could have pretty quickly picked up those 14 yards, but it was a shoestring ankle tackle by Isaiah Foskey, who had dropped away from the defensive line to go and make that play that actually forced the punt that led to the 82-yard touchdown drive led by Spencer Rattler and the New Orleans Saints offense. So I will put a, very important medal on Isaiah Foskey for that play in particular. But outside of that, just as a pass rusher, we continue to not see much of a contribution from him in that area of the game, which is still so very surprising at this time, because this is a guy, again, who we expected was going to walk into this New Orleans Saints Brandon Staley defensive scheme and thrive because of how much it was like this Notre Dame offense. And so he ended up with a hurry during this game, but the hurry came on a block that was unblocked, or a rep rather that was unblocked, according to PFF. And so, the trade-off there is, there's a pressure, but there was also an unblocked rep that kind of led to that pressure. And so what happens when you actually get engaged with an offensive lineman? That is where Isaiah Foskey has so far struggled. So still tough to find a way over the course of the first 2 games to really start to carve anything out for Isaiah Foskey, but he'll get another opportunity up against Denver. And if he has a good showing, it could be enough to convince the Saints to keep him around, but definitely a name to be watching as we get closer and closer. I want to go to a starting offensive lineman, Cesar Ruiz. Struggled in this game, struggled last week as well, and struggled against the Los Angeles Rams. And in particular, what he's continued to struggle with is handling stunts. And so I don't know if maybe that improves when Eric McCoy is in the situation and you're able to kind of diagnose some of those things, communicate a little bit better. You have your stalwart guy there. But the Saints have got to get something figured out in terms of handling these stunts, these twists that have given them so much trouble, and in particular have given Cesar Ruiz so much trouble. Pro Football Focus has him notched with 3 times being beaten by the player on the opposite side of him. And for a guy that didn't play as many reps as you would, that many reps in a game, you would expect that number to be much, much lower than it is. And so I think Ruiz is one of those guys that maybe is kind of taking some steps in the wrong direction currently and needs to sort of get that kind of corrected as quickly as he can throughout this preseason. I don't think that there's going to be a situation where he's got to worry about not making a roster or anything like that. That's certainly not going to be the case for him. But I do think that there is, that there are some long-term situations here where the Saints need to kind of know what they have. And again, there's no loyalty on this coaching staff, right? Like there's, the guys that were around when Cesar Ruiz were drafted aren't around anymore. Well, Brendan Nugent maybe a little bit, but these guys don't have a lot of loyalties to these players. And so as we saw with the Khalen Saunders trade that we discussed earlier on in today's show. So just somebody that I think just keep an eye out on and see maybe how things continue to develop for him as he goes through the rest of this preseason and then gets into the regular season next year. Donovan Peoples-Jones, the wide receiver, still somebody that's kind of been mostly invisible in terms of contributions and things like that. And it's a little surprising because I don't think he saw any snaps at all during this game. If I am recalling correctly, I'm not seeing him on my snap list either. And so he just, for a team like the New Orleans Saints that don't really have any big bodied pass catchers, you figure that he would be one of those guys with the physicality with which he plays, the impressive nature in which he utilizes that physicality, that he would be somebody pushing to get out on the field, but hasn't been able to get out past guys like Kevin Austin Jr., Cedric Wilson, Dante Pettis, and Mason Tipton. So Donovan Peoples-Jones looks to be coasting towards a veteran practice squad spot at best with this New Orleans Saints team so far. He didn't do himself any favors, but he also didn't get any opportunity to do himself any favors in the second preseason game. So he's a name to watch up against the Denver Broncos next week. How about tight end Michael Jacobson, a guy that we were really looking for in this game, somebody that we had highlighted earlier this week as a guy that had a real shot, played 21 snaps in this matchup, but didn't come up with a ton of contributions over on the offensive side throughout this one. Actually, Trayton Welsh looked to have kind of leapt him a bit during this game. Trayton Welsh saw more snaps. He saw snaps earlier than Michael Jacobson did. Michael Jacobson had two receptions for 12 yards with a long of 7. Meanwhile, Trayton Welsh had 2, but he had him for 30 yards, including a long of 28, and he saw the field a lot throughout this game. And so I was a little bit surprised to see Michael Jacobson not get a ton of opportunities. And Trayton Welsh saw 14 snaps to Michael Jacobson's 21. So it kind of goes to show you that they were getting a longer look at Michael Jacobson and are clearly feeling pretty okay about Trayton Welsh. So something to watch there in terms of where things are going. I thought maybe, 6'7", 6'6" type frame like a Michael Jacobson has, who has been awesome throughout the training camps over the course of the past couple of years, that this might finally be his opportunity to shine. And unfortunately, we just didn't get an opportunity to see that up against Jacksonville. And then James Burnip, the undrafted free agent punter, looks to be kind of steadily falling behind Kai Kroger, who averaged 49.5 yards per punt. This was a big day for Kai Kroger to go out there. I thought Kai Kroger strung together a couple of really good practices too. And so that punter battle continues to heat up. But I think Kai Kroger might be kind of creating some distance here so far. All right, coming up in tomorrow's show, we'll do a deeper dive looking at the numbers from this preseason game and get you everything that you need to know. Don't forget, you can catch us on the Gulf Coast Sports and Entertainment Network. We appreciate you very much, as always, making us a part of your day, part of your routine, for saying yes to me on the show. If you see me, please say hi. If you need anything else around your New Orleans Saints in between these episodes, make sure you follow me on your favorite social media at Ross Jackson, NOLA. Hit me up, no matter what the family's doing, no matter how you living. Let me know how you're momming them. And trust Who Dat Nation, I'll holla at you.